Sir, the boy lived with me in the orphanage. Lillian's cry shattered the hushed reverence of the portrait gallery. The feather duster slipped from her trembling fingers, falling soundlessly onto the gleaming marble. Her eyes locked on the oil painting suspended in its gilded frame, where soft lamplight illuminated a silver-haired child's face she'd never expected to see again. Not here, not in this world of wealth and power. Before we dive into this twisted tale of secrets and lost children, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story gets dark, emotional, and absolutely wild. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's continue. The crystal wine glass in King Damon's hand shattered. Not cracked, shattered. Shards of Venetian glass scattered across the floor as his piercing gaze snapped toward the trembling maid. The air in the gallery grew heavy. Behind him, Marcus, his loyal guard, straightened with sudden alertness, hand moving instinctively toward his sword. "What did you say?" The aristocrat's voice was ice over steel, cultured but dangerous. Lillian's throat constricted, but she forced the words out. "That boy in the portrait, his name was Kelvin. We shared a dormitory at Thornfield Orphanage. He used to share his meals with me when the portions were small." A tremor ran through Damon's aristocratic frame, so subtle that only someone who'd served him for months would notice. But Lillian saw it. She saw the carefully maintained composure slip for a fraction of a heartbeat. "Impossible." His words cut like a blade wrapped in silk. "That portrait depicts Prince Damien, my son, lost 20 years ago in a fire. Not some orphan child. He was real, sir." Tears burned tracks down Lillian's face, her maid's uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too small. He was terrified of thunderstorms. He drew pictures of this mansion over and over, though he'd never been here. He vanished one night during a storm, and nobody ever found him. Damon crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides, his elegant burgundy coat sweeping behind him. He lifted the portrait from the wall with both hands and held it inches from her face, those intense eyes boring into hers. "Look at this face. Look at those eyes. This is my son, nobility, breeding, legacy. Not some orphan's delusion." Lillian's voice broke, but she didn't look away. He had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind his left ear. He could write with both hands, said someone once told him it was important for balance. And he always, her breath hitched. He always hummed the same lullaby when the younger children cried. A melody with no words, just longing and hope. The portrait trembled in Damon's hands. Behind them, Marcus stepped forward, his voice carefully measured. "My lord, perhaps the girl is mistaken. Grief can play tricks on memory. He called me Lily." Lillian's eyes never left Damon's. "Nobody else ever called me that. Just Kelvin." The silver-haired man's joy tightened almost imperceptibly. That melody. He knew that melody. His late wife had hummed it to their infant son during peaceful evenings before the tragedy. A song never written down, never shared beyond their private chambers, a family secret buried with her in flames. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the gallery. A young housemaid appeared in the arched doorway, perhaps 16, with curious eyes and a tea tray. "Sir, I thought you might want—" She stopped, seeing the tension. "My apologies. I'll return later." "No." Damon's command was absolute, but his voice lacked its usual authority, as if the foundation of his certainty was cracking. "Leave the tray and go." The young maid quickly set down the silver service, but her gaze found Lillian's tear-stained face. Something in the older maid's expression, raw grief, desperate truth, made her hesitate. Lillian managed a trembling smile despite everything. "It's all right, dear. Just old memories. The kitchen needs you more than we do right now." The girl nodded slowly, as if memorizing the moment, then disappeared down the corridor. When her footsteps faded into silence, King Damon's carefully maintained control finally fractured. The portrait clattered onto a nearby velvet-cushioned bench. He sank into the ornate chair behind him, the first time in anyone's memory that the proud aristocrat had shown such visible loss of composure. "Tell me everything." The command hung in the air between them, raw and desperate. Damon's silver hair had fallen slightly from its perfect arrangement, making him look less like an untouchable aristocrat and more like a man who'd been struck by lightning. Lillian's hands twisted in her apron, years of servitude making her want to curtsy and flee. But the weight of Kelvin's memory held her steady. "Where should I begin, sir?" "The beginning." Damon's voice cracked on the second word. "Every detail you remember. Leave nothing out." She swallowed hard, her mind racing back through 15 years of carefully buried grief to the cold stone halls of Thornfield Orphanage. "Kelvin arrived when I was 9. The matron said he'd been found wandering the road after a house fire, covered in soot and ash. He had no memory of how he got there, just fragments. Dreams, he called them." "What kind of dreams?" Damon leaned forward, his composure fracturing with each word. "Grand halls lit by 1,000 candles. A woman with dark hair singing in a voice like honey. A man who moved through rooms like he owned the very air." Lillian's eyes met his. "A man with silver hair and sad eyes who promised to find him no matter how long it took." Damon's hand rose to his chest as if she'd struck him. Behind them, Marcus shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The other children thought Kelvin was strange. Lillian continued, her voice steadying as memory pulled her backward. "He was too refined for an orphan, used words we didn't know, held himself like he expected to be obeyed. And he could see better in the dark than daylight. The matrons thought it was odd, but they never questioned it." She paused, her throat tight. "He was always cold. His hands were like ice, no matter how close we sat to the fire." Marcus stepped forward, his concern evident. "My lord, perhaps the maid should rest. This has been a shock for everyone. She'll speak." Damon's gaze never left Lillian's face. "Won't you?" It wasn't a question, but somehow it wasn't a threat either. It was a plea wrapped in aristocratic authority, and Lillian found herself nodding. "He could write and draw with both hands," she said quietly. "Switch between them without thought. The matrons tried to force him to use only his right, said the left was unnatural. But he couldn't stop." She demonstrated the motion unconsciously, her own hands moving. "He said someone once told him that balance was survival, that a person should never depend on just one strength." Damon stood abruptly, turning away from her. His shoulders trembled. "I taught my son that. When he was 5 years old, I taught him ambidextrous swordsmanship. Said a warrior who favored one side was a warrior half-trained." Lillian's breath caught. "Kelvin used to draw constantly," she pressed on. "Always the same thing, a mansion with tall windows and marble columns. He'd sketch it in the dirt, on scraps of paper, even in the frost on window panes during winter." She looked at the portrait gallery around them. "This mansion, sir. He was drawing this place." The silence that followed was suffocating. When Damon finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "What else?" He was terrified of storms. Every time thunder rolled, he'd wake screaming about fire and smoke and someone calling his name. Lillian's own tears began to fall again. "I'd sit with him until dawn, holding his hand, telling him he was safe. And every time, he'd say the same thing, 'Lily, somewhere my father is looking for me. I know it. I can feel it in my bones.'" Damon turned back to face her, and for the first time, she saw tears glistening in the powerful man's eyes. "Tell me about the night he vanished." Lillian's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was a storm, worse than any I'd seen before. Thunder shook the foundations. Kelvin was terrified, but then something changed. He said the lightning felt like it was calling him, that he needed to go outside. I begged him not to, but he had this look in his eyes, desperate and determined." She pressed her hand to her heart. "He kissed my cheek and whispered, 'Don't forget me, Lily. No matter what happens, remember I was real.'" "What happened then?" Marcus asked, his professional demeanor slipping into genuine concern. By morning, he was gone. His bed was empty, the window open despite the storm. We searched for weeks, but found nothing. The matrons eventually said he'd run away." Lillian's voice broke completely. I never believed it. Kelvin wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Not properly. He loved me too much for that. The silence stretched until Damon moved with sudden decision. Marcus, prepare the East guest chambers. Miss. He paused, realizing he didn't know her surname. Just Lillian, sir. Orphans don't have family names. Something in his expression softened. Lillian, then. You're not a maid anymore, not while we investigate this. His jaw tightened. If there's even a chance that boy was my son, that he lived and I never knew, he couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus, send word to Dr. Thorne. Tell him I need to see every record from 20 years ago. Everything related to the fire, the search, all of it. My lord, Marcus said carefully, perhaps we should proceed cautiously. If word spreads. I don't care who knows. For the first time in years, Damon's voice carried something beyond authority. It carried hope, desperate and dangerous. If my son survived that fire, if he lived as an orphan while I sat in this mansion grieving, then I will tear this city apart to find out why. Lillian stood trembling as the weight of her revelation settled over them all. Somewhere in the depths of the mansion, a clock chimed midnight, and the portrait's painted eyes seemed to follow her as Marcus led her from the gallery toward a life she'd never imagined possible. The knock came just before dawn, so soft Lillian almost missed it beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. She'd been awake all night in the guest chambers, unable to reconcile the silk sheets and velvet curtains with 15 years of sleeping on straw mattresses. When she opened the door, Marcus stood in the corridor, dressed not in his formal guard uniform but in simple dark clothing that made him look less like a sentinel and more like a conspirator. Get dressed, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the empty hallway. Quickly. There's something you need to see before the household wakes. 10 minutes later, Lillian followed Marcus through passages she'd never known existed during her months of service, corridors that twisted away from the grand halls and into the mansion's private bones. The air grew colder with each descending step, her breath misting before her face. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't slow his pace. Because I've served King Damon for 15 years. I've watched him search every shadow, chase every rumor, destroy himself looking for his son. He paused at a junction, pressing his palm against what looked like solid wood paneling. A door materialized, groaning open on hidden hinges. Last night, I saw hope in his eyes for the first time since the fire. If there's even a chance you're telling the truth, I need to know. And if I'm not? The question hung between them as they entered a vast private study. Then I'll escort you from this mansion myself and tell the king you were a cruel opportunist. But there was no real malice in his voice, only desperate, exhausted need. The study was dominated by a massive desk of dark mahogany, its surface covered in ledgers and correspondence. But Marcus moved past it to a wall lined with locked filing cabinets, each bearing a small brass plate. He pulled a keyring from his pocket, clearly not his own, and began opening drawers with practiced efficiency. The king keeps his most sensitive documents here. Records the elite council would prefer buried. His hands moved quickly through folders. If there's any truth to what happened 20 years ago, it would be he stopped, his face paling. Here. Lillian stepped closer as Marcus pulled out a leather portfolio, its cover embossed with words that made her blood run cold. The Resurrection Initiative, confidential. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first page bore the official seal of the Elite Council and a date from 20 years prior. A proposal, written in clinical language that turned her stomach. Following the tragic loss of Prince Damien in the Manor Fire, we propose a revolutionary approach to preserving noble bloodlines. Through the experimental transfer of preserved neural patterns into compatible human vessels, we may achieve what was previously thought impossible, the restoration of consciousness beyond death. Marcus looked over her shoulder, his professional composure cracking. God's teeth. This can't be real. But it was. Page after page documented the horror. Orphan children identified as potential subjects. Medical procedures that read like torture masked as science. Clinical notes documenting failures with the detachment of butchers recording spoiled meat. Subject M01, deceased. Neural integration failure, day 3. Subject T04, deceased. Severe psychological breakdown, day 7. Subject R09, deceased. Physical rejection of transferred patterns, day 12. Lillian's vision blurred with tears as the list continued. 14 children, each reduced to a designation and a cause of death. 14 lives sacrificed before. She turned the page and saw it. Subject K15, male, age 10, silver hair, blue eyes. Status: successful integration. Neural patterns accepted with unprecedented compatibility. Subject demonstrates retention of original donor memories alongside developing host consciousness. Recommend continued monitoring and stabilization protocols. Below that, another entry made her heart stop. Subject L14, female, age 9. Status: minimal integration. Neural patterns rejected, but subject demonstrates unusual psychic resonance with K15. Recommend psychic binding to stabilize primary transfer. Subject can serve as emotional anchor. I was part of it, Lillian whispered, the folder falling from her hands. They experimented on me too. Marcus caught her before her legs gave out, guiding her to sit on the edge of the desk. You didn't know. You were a child. That's why I could always find him in the dark. Why I always knew when he was afraid. Her laugh was broken, edged with hysteria. We weren't just friends. We were bound. They made us into things. You're still human, Marcus said firmly, but his own horror was evident. Whatever they did to you didn't take. But Kelvin, he picked up the folder, reading further. The notes say the integration was 90% complete when the subject escaped. That means Kelvin became what they wanted, Lillian finished, her voice hollow. A vessel. A body for a dead prince's consciousness. The sound of footsteps echoed from the passage above. Multiple sets, moving with purpose and authority. Marcus's hand went instinctively to the sword he wasn't wearing. Someone knows we're here. King Damon materialized in the doorway, moving with the swift grace of barely controlled fury. Behind him came an elderly man in physician's robes, his face carefully neutral. Dr. Thorne, Lillian realized with dawning dread. What have you found? Damon's eyes fell on the scattered documents, the open filing cabinets, the evidence of their intrusion. Then his gaze fixed on Marcus, with an intensity that would have shattered a lesser man. Marcus straightened, showing no fear despite the rage radiating from his sovereign. He pulled out the Resurrection Initiative portfolio and held it forward like a weapon. The truth, my lord. The truth your court has been hiding for 20 years. Damon snatched the folder, his eyes scanning the pages with inhuman speed. With each line, his expression darkened until fury gave way to something far more terrible, anguish. Vessels for consciousness transfer, he read aloud, his voice like grinding stone. Neural pattern preservation. Compatible human subjects. He couldn't finish, the portfolio crumpling in his grip. My lord, I knew nothing of this, Dr. Thorne said quickly, but his voice carried the tremor of a man caught in a lie. These records predate my direct involvement in. Liar. Damon's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. Your signature is on half these documents. You were chief physician when my son died. The orphanages fell under medical oversight. Dr. Thorne took an involuntary step backward. I merely administered the program as directed. I didn't involve myself in. Her name is in here. Damon thrust the folder toward him, pages falling loose. The maid's name, marked as Subject L14. You watched these children, monitored the experiments, and said nothing. My lord, please. How many? The question cut like a blade. How many children did you sacrifice trying to resurrect my son? Dr. Thorne's silence was answer enough. The explosion of rage that followed shook the study's foundations. Books tumbled from shelves, glass shattered in cabinet doors, and in that moment, Lillian saw the carefully controlled aristocrat transform into something raw and dangerous, a father confronted with unthinkable betrayal. The portrait called to her. Lillian couldn't explain it any other way. Standing in the gallery 3 nights after the study's revelations, she felt the painted eyes pulling at something deep inside her chest. The mansion slept around her, silent except for the distant tick of clocks and the whisper of wind against windows. She'd been unable to sleep, haunted by the clinical notations in those files. Subject L14. Psychic resonance. Emotional anchor. Words that had stripped away her sense of self and replaced it with the terrible knowledge that even her friendship with Kelvin had been manufactured, engineered, weaponized by people who saw children as raw materials. Her hand rose without conscious thought, fingers stretching toward the canvas. Don't. The voice came from behind her. Damon, standing in the gallery entrance in a dressing gown, his silver hair loose around his shoulders. Dr. Thorne's notes mention psychic connection between you and the portrait. We don't know what touching it might do. Maybe that's exactly why I need to. Lillian's voice was steadier than she felt. If Kelvin is trapped somehow, if any part of him remains, I'm the only one who can reach him. Damon crossed the gallery, standing beside her. His aristocratic features were haggard, aged by grief and guilt. Then I'll be here when you return. Lillian took a breath and pressed her palm flat against the painted surface. The world shattered. Cold. So cold. Can't breathe. Can't move. Trapped between here and there, real and not real, memory and present, Kelvin's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. Lillian gasped as the vision slammed into her consciousness. She was no longer in the gallery. She stood in a place between places where architecture bent against reason. The orphanage's stone walls merged seamlessly with the mansion's marble columns, creating impossible geometry that hurt to observe. Shadows moved with intention, and in the center of this nightmare space, chained to nothing but still unable to move, was Kelvin. But not the boy she remembered. This Kelvin existed in 2 states simultaneously, one moment the silver-haired child from Thornfield, the next a refined young man with aristocratic bearing and eyes that held too much knowledge. He flickered between identities like a candle flame in wind. Lily. His voice carried both relief and despair. Is that really you, or am I dreaming again? I'm real. She tried to move toward him, but her feet wouldn't obey. Kelvin, what happened to you? Where are you? I don't know anymore. The admission was raw with pain. The night I ran from the orphanage, I thought I was escaping. But the storm, it wasn't natural. Lightning struck me, but it was red, Lily. Red like blood, and I felt something tearing inside my head. The vision shifted violently. Lillian saw through Kelvin's eyes running through woods, thunder overhead, then the crimson lightning splitting the sky. It struck with surgical precision, and Kelvin's body convulsed as something within him tried to separate, to flee, to return to its source. The transfer broke, Kelvin explained, his form flickering more rapidly now. The prince's consciousness, they'd bound it to me so thoroughly that when the technology failed, neither of us could exist completely. Part of him returned to the portrait, where Damon's blood in the paint gave it a vessel. But I was still alive, still holding fragments of him, so his voice cracked. We both got trapped. Him in the painting, me in the space between. The scene shifted again, showing the portrait in Damon's gallery, glowing with that same terrible crimson light. The painting holds his memories, his nobility, his power, everything that made him Prince Damien. Kelvin's words came faster, desperate. But I have his heart, Lily. I have the love he felt for his father, the loss, the longing. I'm trapped between what I was and what they tried to make me become. Lillian felt tears freezing on her cheeks. We're going to free you. Both of you. Damon knows the truth now. I know. I can feel him sometimes, standing in front of the portrait, calling for his son. Kelvin's expression broke with emotion. But I'm not his son, Lily. I'm just Kelvin Vale, an orphan who survived too long. Prince Damien died in that fire. I'm just the broken vessel they tried to pour him into. You're real. Lillian's voice rang with conviction. You matter. You're not just an experiment. A third vision crystallized, this one a memory. The laboratory beneath Thornfield Orphanage, where Lillian herself lay on a cold table, no more than 9 years old. Dr. Thorne pressed something sharp against her temple while another device touched Kelvin's. Light arced between them, and she felt something fundamental shift in her consciousness, a tether forming, invisible but unbreakable. They made us connected, Kelvin whispered. Soul-bound, the files called it. So I would have someone to anchor me during the integration, someone to keep me human while they tried to turn me into someone else. You weren't just my friend, Lily. You were my lifeline. The only thing that kept me from being completely consumed by another person's identity. I don't remember any of this. Lillian's voice was small, broken. They took your memories of the procedure. But the bond remains. That's why you can hear me when no one else can. Why you could always find me in the dark, always knew when I was afraid. The visions began to fracture, reality bleeding back in. Find me, Lily. Find what's left of my body. It's in the abandoned asylum on the north edge of the city, the place they took us for the final procedures before I escaped. How do you know? Because I can still feel it sometimes. My body, dying slowly in that place, trapped between life and death, just like my consciousness is trapped here. The portrait holds part of me. My body holds the rest. Bring them together and maybe finally, his voice rose to a wail that made the vision shake. Maybe finally I can either die properly or live as something whole. Lillian fought against the vision's grip, straining toward him. We'll find you. I promise. But Kelvin's form was fading, transparency increasing until she could see through him to the impossible architecture beyond. I'm not his son, he repeated, voice growing distant. I'm not the prince. I'm just a broken experiment that should have died years ago. The kindest thing you could do is let me go. No. She fought against the rooted feeling, reaching for him. You're you, Kelvin Vale. My friend. My brother. You're real and you matter and I won't let you fade. Pain exploded through her hand. Lillian was thrown backward, her palm smoking where it had touched the portrait. She would have hit the marble floor if Damon hadn't caught her with reflexes born of decades of training, lowering her gently but gripping her shoulders with barely controlled intensity. What did you see? He demanded. Tell me. Lillian gasped for breath, the smell of burned skin acrid in her nostrils. He's alive. Not fully, not in any normal sense, but his consciousness, the part that made him Kelvin, it's trapped between worlds. She looked up at the portrait with new horror. Part of him is in there. The rest is in the abandoned asylum where they conducted the experiments. Damon's grip tightened. Then we find it. Tonight. There's more, Lillian said, her voice breaking. He doesn't want to be saved. He thinks he's just a broken vessel, that the kindest thing we can do is let him die. No. The word was absolute. I've lost him twice already, once to fire, once to conspiracy. I will not lose him to despair. The hours before dawn were the longest. Lillian stood beside Damon in the portrait gallery, both of them staring at the painted face as if it might speak. Her hand was bandaged now, the burn from touching the canvas treated by a physician who'd asked no questions. Marcus had been sent to prepare for the journey to the asylum, leaving them alone with painted eyes and impossible truths. Do you know what it's like? Damon's voice broke the silence, raw and human in a way she'd never heard from him. To have your heart torn from your chest while you're still breathing? Lillian's throat tightened, but she said nothing, sensing he needed to speak more than she needed to respond. Damien was 8 years old when the fire started. Damon's aristocratic composure was gone, stripped away to reveal the grieving father beneath. His mother, my wife, Elena, had put him to bed an hour before. I was in my study, working on correspondence that seemed so important at the time. He laughed bitterly. I can't even remember what it was about now. Trade agreements, perhaps. Diplomatic letters. The sort of things that feel vital until you realize how meaningless they are compared to what you've lost. The portrait's eyes seemed to follow them as Damon moved closer, one hand rising as if to touch it, but stopping inches away. I heard the screams first. Elena's voice, calling for Damien. By the time I reached their chambers, the entire East Wing was engulfed. She stood at the window with our son in her arms, flames at her back, and I could see in her eyes that she knew she wouldn't survive. What happened? Lillian asked softly. She threw him to me. Damon's voice broke completely. Wrapped him in a wet blanket and threw him from the second-story window, trusting I would catch him. And I did. God help me, I caught him, and then the ceiling collapsed and she was gone. His hand pressed against his chest as if touching an old wound. I turned to run with Damien to get him to safety, and someone struck me from behind. When I woke, he was gone. Vanished in the chaos of fire and smoke and servants fleeing for their lives. The silence that followed was suffocating. I searched for months, Damon continued. Every orphanage, every hospital, every morgue in a 100-mile radius. I hired investigators, offered rewards so large that half the city was searching. But there was nothing. No body, no trace, no child matching his description anywhere. Finally, I had to accept he couldn't finish the sentence. That he was dead, Lillian finished gently. Yes. Damon's shoulders sagged under the weight of memory. Years passed. A decade. I couldn't move forward, couldn't let go. My advisors suggested I remarry, produce another heir. The elite council grew concerned about succession. And then Dr. Thorne came to me with a proposal. He said science had advanced, that consciousness could be preserved, memories extracted and stored. That if we had genetic material, blood, tissue, anything, we might be able to create a record of who Damien was. Keep him from being forgotten. And you gave them his blood, Lillian said, understanding dawning. I gave them everything. Medical records, genetic samples I'd saved from childhood illnesses, recordings of his voice I'd commissioned before. His voice hardened. I funded the entire program. Told them to do whatever it took to preserve my son's essence. I thought they were creating a memorial, a scientific record for posterity. I didn't know that they would use it to torture children, that they would try to resurrect him through human vessels. Damon turned to face her, and the guilt in his eyes was devastating. 5 years ago, I commissioned this portrait. Had it painted from memory by a master artist. I was forgetting his face, Lillian. After 2 decades, the details were blurring, the exact shade of his eyes, the shape of his smile. It was unbearable. So I mixed my own blood into the oils, following an old tradition. A way to preserve the connection between father and son, to ensure his image would remain vivid. Lillian looked at the portrait with new horror. Your blood in the paint. Damien's neural patterns stored by the initiative. When Kelvin's consciousness fractured, it had somewhere to go. Damon's realization was audible. The portrait wasn't just a painting anymore. It became a vessel, just like Kelvin's body. Part of my son's transferred consciousness returned to the only other container marked with his genetic signature. But it's not just holding him, Lillian said slowly. She moved to the wall, pressing her hand against the marble. I can feel it, a pulse, like a heartbeat running through the stone. She looked at Damon. When did you commission the portrait? 5 years ago, when I expanded the East Wing. The color drained from his face. The expansion was built around this gallery. The portrait was the first thing hung in the new wing. It was meant to be the heart of the new structure. Lillian's voice was hollow. They didn't just want to resurrect the prince. They wanted to create an eternal anchor, a consciousness trapped between life and death, literally sustaining the expansion of your power and legacy. The mansion trembled as if in response to her words. Not violently, but with a deep, fundamental shudder that suggested something waking. The portrait's painted eyes flickered, catching light that didn't exist, and the temperature plummeted. The initiative wasn't just about bringing Damien back, Damon said, his words coming faster as understanding crystallized. It was about creating immortality through consciousness transfer. They sacrificed those children trying to perfect a system where the elite could live forever by jumping from body to body, vessel to vessel. And they used your grief to fund it. Used your blood to anchor it. Used your son's stolen consciousness to power it. Another tremor, stronger this time. Somewhere in the East Wing, something cracked stone or wood or the foundation itself protesting. The portrait pulsed with energy, its frame glowing faintly crimson, and Lillian could swear she heard Kelvin's voice whisper through the walls, "Father, help me." Damon stood motionless for a long moment, aristocratic features hardening into something like resolve. Then he turned to her, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction. "Marcus will have the carriage ready within the hour. We go to the asylum, find what remains of Kelvin's body, and bring it before this portrait." "And then?" Lillian asked, though she already knew. "Then we give him the choice, to finally rest or to try living again as something whole." Damon looked at the East Wing, at the expansion he'd built on the foundation of his grief. "And if destroying this portrait means bringing down everything I've built, then let it fall." His eyes met Lillian's. "I've spent 20 years building a legacy on my son's stolen essence. No more. I'll destroy my own mansion if that's what it takes to give him peace." The portrait blazed brighter, and for a moment, Lillian could have sworn she saw two faces overlapping in the painted features, the noble prince and the orphan boy, finally acknowledging each other's existence. Somewhere between the walls, a child's voice whispered one word that carried both gratitude and warning: "Father." The grand ballroom had been transformed into a courtroom. Lillian stood at its center, hands bound not in rope, but in ceremonial silver chains that marked her as the accused. 12 chairs arranged in a semicircle faced her, thrones, really, each occupied by members of the elite council. Men and women whose wealth and power shaped the city's destiny, their faces beautiful and terrible in the chandelier light. She recognized some from her months of service. Lady Ashford with her diamond necklaces. Lord Sterling, whose carriages always blocked the trade routes. Dr. Thorne sat among them now, his physician's robes replaced with council finery, his expression carefully neutral. The head chair, the highest, the most ornate, stood empty. King Damon refused it, instead standing beside Lillian in simple dark clothing that made him look less like royalty and more like what he truly was, a father seeking truth. "Let the tribunal convene," announced Lord Pembroke, the eldest counselor, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "We gather to address charges brought against the woman Lillian, charges of slander against the crown, disturbing the peace of this household, and conspiracy to damage King Damon's reputation with fabricated tales designed to exploit his grief." Murmurs rippled through the shadows where lesser elite stood witness. Lillian recognized none of them, but felt their collective judgment like pressure against her skull. "Where does the council stand on this matter?" Lady Ashford's voice was silk over steel. "Surely the king presides over accusations concerning his own household." "King Damon has recused himself," answered Lord Sterling, his eyes cold. "The accused has bewitched him with stories crafted to manipulate his paternal grief. In such circumstances, the council must act to protect him from his own compromised judgment." "I told him the truth." Lillian's voice cut through the whispers, surprisingly steady despite the terror singing in her veins. "Something this council has spent 20 years concealing." Shocked silence fell like a blade. "The accused speaks out of turn," Lady Ashford hissed. "Silence her or I shall." "Let her speak." Damon's command was absolute. His aristocratic features were haggard but resolute. "If this council means to judge her, they will hear her testimony in full." "Proceed, Lillian." It could have been permission or condemnation. Lillian chose to believe the former. "Members of the elite council," she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You accuse me of slander, of fabricating stories. But I ask you, what story are we protecting? The myth of Prince Damien, tragically lost in a fire?" She leaned forward despite the chains. Or the truth of Kelvin Vale, a human child your council experimented on, tortured, and ultimately destroyed? Lord Pembroke rose from his chair, face flushing. This is precisely the blasphemy we... Sit down. Damon's voice was a whip crack. The ancient counselor sat, but fury radiated from him in waves. Lillian pressed forward. The Resurrection Initiative. Does any of you deny its existence? Silence. Damning, absolute silence that confirmed everything. I thought not. She looked from face to face, reading guilt in some, cold calculation in others. 14 children died before Kelvin. 14 orphans you deemed expendable in your quest to resurrect a prince, to perfect consciousness transfer. Their names were never recorded. Their bodies were burned and buried in unmarked graves. They simply vanished as if they'd never existed. They were orphans, Lady Ashford said, her tone suggesting this explained everything. Abandoned by fate, unwanted by society. We offered them purpose. You offered them horror. Lillian's shout echoed off marble walls, her composure finally breaking. They were children. Scared, hungry, defenseless children. And you filled them with stolen neural patterns until their minds couldn't take it anymore. Until they died screaming in laboratories beneath orphanages, and you documented it like they were failed experiments in breeding better roses. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Kelvin survived because his mind accepted the transfer. But survival isn't living. You stole his identity, fragmented his consciousness, and trapped him in a hell between life and death for 5 years. She admits to knowing classified council secrets, Dr. Thorne said smoothly, which proves she's been accessing restricted documents. A crime punishable by... I access nothing. Lillian's voice rang clear. I lived it. I was subject L-14, another one of your experiments. You bound my consciousness to Kelvin's to see if human connection could stabilize the transfer. I was 9 years old, and you used me as an anchor for your abomination. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Even Damon's expression shifted. He'd known about her designation, but hearing her speak it with such raw clarity brought new horror to his face. That's Lady Ashford faltered. The record said Subject L-14 showed minimal integration. You were deemed a failure and released. Released to the same orphanage where Kelvin was held captive, Lillian spat. So you could continue monitoring the experiment from a distance. I wasn't freed. I was just part of a longer study, a control group for your twisted research. She turned to face Damon directly. And when the transfer failed, when Kelvin escaped and the consciousness fractured, your council didn't mourn the loss of a prince. They mourned the loss of their immortality engine, their proof that the elite could live forever by stealing children's bodies. That's enough. Lord Pembroke started forward, but the ground trembled beneath them. No, it's not nearly enough. Lillian's voice rose to fill the vast ballroom. You want to convene this tribunal to judge me? To decide my fate based on whether I've committed slander? Then let me tell you what real slander looks like. It looks like calling 14 murdered children acceptable losses in your research notes. It looks like reducing human lives to designation numbers and compatibility percentages. She swept her gaze across all 12 chairs, meeting eyes that had forgotten what it meant to be accountable. Your wealth, your power, your precious social hierarchy, all of it sustained by the suffering of children too powerless to refuse you. You took Damon's grief and weaponized it. You took his son's neural patterns and turned them into fuel for your ambitions. And when one vessel survived long enough to develop hopes and dreams and a personality, you called him defective and tried to erase him. The ballroom erupted. Counselors shouted over each other, some in outrage, others in defense. Lady Ashford stood, face contorted with rage. This woman dares lecture us on morality? Our kind has ruled for generations by making difficult choices by feeding on innocence, Lillian shouted back. At least be honest about what you are. Silence. Damon's roar shook dust from the vaulted ceiling. Power crackled around him, not supernatural, but the accumulated authority of 2 decades of rule. Lillian speaks the truth. A truth I was too blind with grief to see, too desperate to question. The Resurrection Initiative was an abomination. One that his voice broke slightly, that I enabled by providing my son's genetic material and funding. Your Majesty, you are not in your right mind, Dr. Thorne said quickly. Grief makes fools of even the wisest. We only sought to help. Grief is not an excuse for atrocity. Damon descended from the witness platform, moving to stand fully beside Lillian. This council owes her more than judgment. It owes her justice, and it owes 14 dead children the acknowledgement that their lives mattered. Justice? Lord Pembroke's laugh was cruel. She's admitted to being part of the program herself, to interfering with Subject K-15's development, to helping him escape and destroy years of research. If anyone deserves judgment. The portrait screamed. Not metaphorically, an actual psychic wail that tore through the ballroom, driving counselors to their knees and shattering champagne glasses on tables. Lillian felt it differently, not as pain but as desperate, anguished plea. Destroy the frame, Lily. Please. It's the only way. Lord Pembroke staggered to his feet, blood trickling from his nose. Stop this, he commanded, though whether to Lillian or the portrait itself was unclear. You don't understand what you're threatening to destroy. Then enlighten us, Marcus said, entering from the ballroom's side entrance, sword drawn. Tell them what the portrait really is. Pembroke's face went pale. Destroy that frame and the entire east wing collapses. The portrait isn't decoration. It's structurally integrated into the mansion's foundation. Damien's consciousness, Damon's blood, 20 years of psychic energy binding it all together. It's the keystone of everything we've built. Then let it fall, Damon said quietly, and the room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Let it all come down. The mansion convulsed like a living thing in pain. Lillian, Damon, and Marcus stood before the portrait in the gallery as the building trembled around them. Somewhere below, the council was mobilizing. She could hear shouting, the clash of steel as guards chose sides, the screams of servants fleeing a civil war 2 decades in the making. But none of that mattered now. The portrait blazed with light so intense it hurt to look at directly, its gilded frame vibrating against the wall. The painted boy's face was no longer serene, it twisted in agony, mouth open in a silent scream that somehow she could hear in her bones. My lord, we need to move quickly. Marcus positioned himself at the gallery entrance, sword drawn. The council's guards will be here any moment, and not all of them will side with us. Let them come. Damon's voice was hollow, his eyes fixed on the portrait. 20 years I've stared at this painting, never knowing my son was screaming behind the oils. He wasn't alone. Lillian moved closer despite the heat radiating from the canvas. Look. Beneath the surface, shadows moved, not one consciousness, but many, layered like sediment. 15 faces pressed against the paint from within, children ranging from 6 to 12 years old, their expressions frozen in the moment of their deaths. She recognized the designations from the files even without names. Subject M01. Subject T04. Subject R09. All of them trapped, all of them suffering. God above. Marcus's professional composure cracked completely. The initiative didn't just fail with those children. It captured them. Every consciousness they tried to transfer that rejected its host got pulled into the portrait instead, Damon finished, horror dawning. Because I painted it with my blood, created a vessel that called to Damien's neural patterns. Every failed experiment, every dying child's last thoughts, they all ended up here. Feeding the structure. Sustaining the conspiracy. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the marble floor. The portrait pulsed like a heart, and Lillian felt Kelvin's presence stronger than ever, not just his voice but his fear, his pain, his desperate need to end the torment. Do it now, his voice echoed through her mind. Do it before we bring everyone down. Before we take innocence with us. We need to evacuate the East Wing first, Marcus protested. If Pembroke was right about the structural integration, there's no time. Lillian pointed at the walls where cracks were already spreading, stone grinding against stone. The portrait is failing on its own. The council's attempt to suppress it, to use its power to maintain control, it accelerated the decay. We have minutes at most. Footsteps thundered in the corridor. Lord Pembroke appeared with a contingent of guards, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Stop them. The portrait cannot be destroyed. The economic foundations of this entire district, the trade agreements, the social structure, everything depends on the stability of this mansion's east wing. You built an empire on tortured children, Damon said, his voice cutting. Perhaps it deserves to fall. You don't understand. Pembroke pushed past the guards, genuine fear replacing his authoritarian mask. That portrait doesn't just hold consciousnesses, it's been channeling psychic energy into the city's infrastructure for 5 years. Banks, hospitals, schools, all drawing on its power without knowing. Destroy it, and you don't just collapse a wing. You destabilize half the city's foundational investments. Then the city will have to rebuild honestly, Lillian said. She turned to the wall where an ornate candelabra stood, solid bronze and heavy enough to crush bone. Her hands closed around it. Girl, wait. Dr. Thorne appeared behind Pembroke, his physician's instincts overriding his conspirator's caution. The psychic backlash could kill you. You are bound to subject K-15. When the portrait breaks, you'll feel every consciousness's release like a knife through your skull. Then I'll die knowing I freed them. Lillian lifted the candelabra, its weight somehow feeling right in her hands. She looked at Damon. Whatever happens next, know that Kelvin forgave you. He told me in the vision, said maybe blood doesn't make a father, maybe love does. Damon's composure shattered. His hand rose to his mouth, silver hair falling forward to hide tears. Finish it, he whispered. Give them peace. The portrait screamed again, and this time all 15 voices joined in chorus, children crying out in languages and dialects from across 2 decades, a symphony of anguish that drove Pembroke and his guards to their knees. Lillian felt Kelvin's voice rise above the others. Thank you, Lily. For everything. For remembering me. For making me matter. She swung with all her strength. The candelabra connected with the gilded frame, and reality exploded. Light erupted outward, not crimson now, but pure white, brilliant and terrible. It tore through the gallery like a scream made visible, ripping through air and stone and the very fabric of whatever dark magic had sustained the portrait. Lillian was thrown backward, caught by Marcus's quick reflexes before she hit the marble. The portrait's canvas split from top to bottom with a sound like tearing silk. The gilded frame crumbled to ash, and from the rupture, they emerged. 14 spirits poured out like water breaking through a dam. Children translucent and shimmering, their forms flickering between the ages they'd died and the ages they might have reached. They looked confused, lost, as if waking from nightmares they couldn't quite remember. One by one, they turned upward, toward a ceiling that no longer seemed to exist, toward light that had nothing to do with chandeliers or dawn. Subject M01 went first, a small boy who smiled with sudden recognition before dissolving into golden warmth. Then T04, R09, each consciousness finding its release and fading like morning mist burned away by sun. They rose through the cracking ceiling toward something Lillian couldn't see but could feel, peace, finally, after years of torment. But the 15th remained. Kelvin stood before the ruined portrait, and he was beautiful in his wholeness. No longer flickering between identities, no longer the refined, painted prince with aristocratic bearing. He was simply the boy Lillian remembered from Thornfield Orphanage, silver-haired, blue-eyed, with that gentle smile that had made cold nights bearable. He looked down at his translucent hands, then up at the 3 figures watching him. His gaze found Damon, and the aristocrat had fallen to his knees, tears streaming down his face unchecked. "You're not my father," Kelvin said gently, and the words should have been cruel but weren't. "Prince Damien died in that fire 20 years ago. I know that now. I can feel his memory separate from mine, can tell where he ended and I began." Damon's expression crumbled, but Kelvin moved closer, kneeling so they were eye to eye. But you searched for me anyway. You grieved for me. You were willing to destroy everything you'd built to set me free. He reached out with a translucent hand, and though it passed through Damon's cheek like smoke, the gesture carried weight. So maybe blood doesn't define family. Maybe love does. Maybe choosing to do right when you learn you've done wrong. Maybe that's what makes a father. I'm sorry, Damon choked out. I'm so sorry for all of it. For the experiments, for the pain, for not knowing. I know, Kelvin smiled, heartbreaking in its innocence. And I forgive you. The east wing groaned, a deep fundamental sound of something dying. The walls cracked wider, chunks of ceiling beginning to fall. Kelvin looked at Lillian, his smile widening. Thank you, Lily. For the bread, the friendship, for the key that night. For remembering my name when they tried to make me into someone else. Kelvin, no, but even as she protested, he was fading. Tell them, he whispered, voice dissipating like smoke on wind. Tell them we were real. All 15 of us. We had names, dreams, fears. We mattered. We were more than experiments or acceptable losses. I will, Lillian promised through tears. I swear it. The first ray of true dawn broke through the fracturing ceiling, and Kelvin turned his face toward it with an expression of pure wonder, the light he dreamed of for 5 years in that liminal space, finally touching what remained of his soul. I can see the sun, he breathed. It's so beautiful. Then he was gone, dissolved into gold and warmth and morning, rising with the other spirits toward whatever waited beyond pain. The portrait frame collapsed into ash, and the east wing of Damon's mansion began its final, terrible collapse. They escaped through collapsing corridors as the east wing died around them. Marcus carried Lillian when her burned hand made gripping the stair railings impossible, while Damon moved ahead with the desperate efficiency of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and refused to lose more. The mansion groaned and shuddered, centuries-old stone cracking like brittle bone. Behind them, not everyone made it out. Lillian heard the screams, Lord Pembroke's voice cutting off mid-shout as a ceiling collapsed, Dr. Thorne's final cry for mercy swallowed by falling marble. The counselors who'd clung to the portrait's power, who'd built their fortunes on stolen consciousness and murdered children, were consumed by the very structure they'd corrupted. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt only exhaustion and grief. They burst through the main entrance as dawn broke fully over the city. Behind them, the mansion's east wing stood as a hollow ruin, walls intact but gutted, windows shattered like gouged eyes, the elegant facade now a beautiful corpse that would never house life again. Smoke rose from the gallery where the portrait had hung, carrying with it the ash of conspiracy and lies. Servants and guards who'd chosen truth over loyalty gathered in the gardens, staring at the destruction with expressions ranging from horror to relief. Marcus set Lillian down gently, then moved to organize the survivors, his military training taking over where emotion threatened to overwhelm. Damon stood apart, silver-haired disheveled, aristocratic clothing torn and covered in dust. He looked smaller somehow, diminished not by the loss of his wing, but by the weight of understanding what it had cost. Lillian moved to stand beside him, her bandaged hand throbbing, but her heart oddly light. It's over, she said quietly. No. Damon's voice was hoarse from smoke and tears. Now it begins. The truth, the reckoning, the rebuilding. He looked at the ruins. I'll have to answer for what I enabled. The families of those 14 children, if any can be found, deserve compensation. Justice. Whatever meaning those words can still hold after such atrocity. You didn't know what they'd do with your grief. Ignorance isn't innocence. His jaw tightened. I funded the research. I provided the genetic material. I was so desperate to hold on to Damien's memory that I gave them the tools to torture children in his name. He turned to face her. That's my burden to carry. But you gave them freedom. You remembered when the world wanted them forgotten. Lillian looked at the ruins, thinking of 15 faces dissolving into light. Kelvin asked me to tell people they were real. That they mattered. She met Damon's eyes. I'm going to honor that promise. I'm going to make sure every one of those children is remembered by name, not designation. Then you'll need resources. Damon's expression hardened with purpose. The mansion still stands, mostly. What remains of my fortune, my influence, it's yours to use as you see fit. Build something from these ashes. Something that honors them. The morning sun continued its rise, painting the ruins in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, calling the city to morning prayers, unaware that half their foundational investments had just crumbled. There would be chaos in the coming days, economic uncertainty, political upheaval, investigations that would shake the elite to their core. But standing in that garden, watching smoke rise from the mansion's hollow east wing, Lillian felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years of grief and servitude. Hope. Not the naive hope of childhood, but the harder, fiercer hope that comes from surviving what should have destroyed you. What will you call it? Damon asked. Whatever you build from this. Lillian didn't hesitate. Kelvin's Light. A sanctuary for children who need someone to remember their names. A place where no one is just a number or an experiment or an acceptable loss. Damon nodded slowly, something like peace settling over his haggard features. He would have liked that. The ruins stood silent behind them, a monument to the cost of redemption. The East Wing would never be rebuilt, Damon had already declared. It would remain as it was, a reminder that some foundations built on suffering must fall for genuine healing to begin. A testament that the powerful must be held accountable, that the voiceless deserve justice, and that a name remembered is a life honored. The investigations began within hours. City magistrates arrived with ledgers and questions, their faces grave as they surveyed the ruins. Marcus met them at the gate, presenting the Resurrection Initiative documents with the clinical efficiency of a soldier delivering a battlefield report. The files spoke for themselves: dates, names, designations, clinical notes documenting atrocities in handwriting that could be verified and cross-referenced. By noon, warrants had been issued for the surviving council members. Lady Ashford was found in her townhouse, already packing to flee. Lord Sterling barricaded himself in his estate and had to be extracted by force. Others came quietly, their aristocratic composure finally shattered by the weight of exposure. Dr. Thorne's body was recovered from the East Wing ruins 3 days later, crushed beneath the laboratory equipment he'd used to torture children. Lillian watched it all from the mansion's west terrace, her burned hand healing slowly under proper medical care. The city transformed around her as the truth spread, not through official channels at first, but through servants' gossip and merchants' rumors, the underground network that had always known something was wrong with the orphanages, the adoption programs, the children who vanished without trace. The elite council's remaining members called for Damon's abdication. He gave it to them without fight, signing documents that transferred his titles and properties to a public trust with a single condition, that a portion of every holding be dedicated to child welfare and protection. He kept only the mansion's intact wings and enough fortune to fund what came next. I thought you'd fight them, Lillian said one evening as they reviewed architectural plans in what had been a study. You could have weathered this scandal with your power base. Damon looked older now, silver hair showing strands of white at the temples. What power base? I enabled the torture of 15 children because I was too blinded by grief to question what I was funding. He set down his pen. Some positions, once compromised, cannot be restored. Better to step aside and let someone untainted lead. You're not untainted either, she reminded him gently. None of us are. We all benefited from systems built on exploitation. Which is precisely why we have to do better. He gestured to the plans, blueprints for converting the mansion's intact wings into a sanctuary. Not maintain the structures that enabled harm, but transform them into something that prevents it. The plans took shape over weeks. The West Wing would house children rescued from abusive situations. The North Wing would become a school, education-free and open to any child regardless of birth or status. The South Wing would serve as administrative offices for a new organization dedicated to investigating and prosecuting those who exploited the vulnerable. And the East Wing? Lillian asked. Remains exactly as it is. Damon's voice was firm. A memorial. Every child's name carved into stone where the portrait gallery once stood. Not designations, names. We're still searching records, trying to identify them all. Some may never be known, but they'll be remembered. Marcus oversaw the construction, his military precision ensuring that every detail honored the dead while serving the living. Former servants who'd chosen truth over loyalty were offered positions in the new organization. Those who'd remained silent but not actively participated were given the choice to stay or leave with severance. The city slowly stabilized. The economic disruption from the East Wing's collapse proved less catastrophic than Lord Pembroke had threatened. Turned out most of the foundational investments had been embezzlement schemes disguised as civic projects. The banks reorganized. The hospitals found new funding. The schools adapted. But the social structure transformed fundamentally. The elite council was disbanded, replaced by a democratically elected civic assembly that included representatives from every district, including the poorest. The orphanages were investigated, reformed, many shut down entirely in favor of fostering programs with strict oversight. 6 weeks after the portrait shattered, Lillian stood in what would become Kelvin's Light, the sanctuary's main hall, freshly painted and filled with simple but sturdy furniture. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, and she could hear children's voices echoing from the courtyard where Marcus was teaching them basic self-defense. Not to create soldiers, he'd explained, but to ensure no child ever felt helpless again. Do you think he'd approve? Damon asked, joining her by the window. His formal attire was gone, replaced by simple work clothes. He'd been helping with construction, his aristocratic hands blistered from manual labor. Lillian thought of Kelvin's final words, his plea that the children be remembered. She thought of his smile as he dissolved into sunlight, finally free from the liminal torment of being trapped between identities. I think he'd say we're trying, she answered. And that trying, honestly and openly, is more than anyone did for him when he was alive. Outside, the ruins of the East Wing stood silent against the evening sky. A monument not to power or legacy, but to the cost of redemption and the price of choosing truth over comfort. The carved names were still being added, but already the memorial bore witness. These children were real, they mattered, and the world would never forget what had been done in the name of preserving power. Some foundations must fall, Lillian whispered, for new growth to begin. Beside her, Damon nodded, and together they watched the sunset paint the ruins in shades of gold and hope. 2 months after the portrait shattered, Kelvin's Light opened its doors. The sanctuary stood at the city's edge where urban sprawl met forest, close enough to access resources, far enough to offer peace. Lillian had chosen the location carefully, wanting children to wake to birdsong rather than the clatter of carriages, to see stars instead of smoke-stained skies. The building itself was modest compared to Damon's mansion, 2 stories of warm stone with wide windows and a wraparound porch. But the gardens were expansive, filled with vegetables and flowers that the children tended themselves. Lillian had learned from Thornfield's cruelty. Children needed beauty and purpose, not just shelter and rules. She stood in the main hall now, watching through windows as 8 children played in the courtyard. The youngest was 5, the oldest 13, all rescued from situations that ranged from neglect to active abuse. They laughed as they chased each other, their voices carrying that particular pitch of joy that comes from finally feeling safe. Miss Lillian. A girl named Emma ran inside, her dark curls bouncing. Marcus is here with supplies. Right on schedule. Lillian smiled, moving to the porch where Marcus was unloading crates from a wagon. The former guard had become the sanctuary's unofficial quartermaster, visiting weekly with food, clothing, books, and whatever else the growing household needed. Brought extra blankets this time, he said, lifting a crate with practiced ease. Winter's coming early this year. And there's a donation from the Merchants Guild, fabric for new clothes, thread, needles. Apparently word's spreading about what you're doing here. Good. Lillian accepted the manifest, checking supplies against her lists. The more people know, the harder it becomes to hide children's suffering again. The Reformed Civic Assembly had established child protection laws within a month of the council's exposure. Mandatory inspections of orphanages and fostering homes. Criminal penalties for those who exploited minors. A reporting system that actually investigated claims rather than burying them. The changes weren't perfect, bureaucracy moved slowly even with good intentions, but they were happening. How is he? Lillian asked quietly, not needing to specify who. Marcus's expression grew somber. Still working himself to exhaustion. He's testified at every trial, provided evidence for every investigation. But he won't come here. Says he doesn't deserve to be near children after what he enabled. He's wrong. Maybe. Marcus lifted another crate. But guilt like that doesn't heal on anyone else's timeline. Give him time. That evening, after the children were fed and the younger ones tucked into bed, Lillian stood at her bedroom window overlooking the road. In the distance, barely visible in the twilight, a carriage waited beneath ancient oak trees, the same carriage that appeared every night, keeping watch from a distance. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered, "Rest now, Kelvin. You're free." The words had become ritual, a nightly acknowledgement of what had been sacrificed to build this place. In the carriage, Damon sat in darkness, his silver hair reflecting moonlight. He came every night, watching the sanctuary's lit windows, listening to the distant echoes of children's laughter. He dismantled the Resurrection Initiative completely, personally ensuring every participant faced justice. He'd established the Child Protection Commission with his remaining influence and fortune. He'd done everything possible to atone. But he couldn't bring himself to cross the threshold of Kelvin's light. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. As Lillian's silhouette appeared in the upstairs window, he raised one hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that had become their silent conversation. She saw him. He saw her. They both understood that some wounds didn't close cleanly, that redemption was measured in choices made daily rather than grand gestures. The night breeze carried a whisper, so faint it might have been imagination. "Thank you, Lily. For everything. For remembering me. For making sure we all mattered." Lillian smiled through tears, recognizing Kelvin's voice, not trapped or tortured now, but peaceful, complete, finally at rest. "You're welcome," she whispered back. "All of you." Dawn came softly to Kelvin's light, bringing with it the sound of children waking, of Emma singing off-key in the washroom, of the youngest ones thundering downstairs toward breakfast. Laughter echoed through halls built not on stolen consciousness or murdered innocence, but on the simple revolutionary act of remembering the forgotten and protecting the vulnerable. In the city, the mansion's East Wing ruins remained visible against the skyline, a monument to the cost of redemption, reminder that some foundations built on suffering must fall for healing to begin. The carved names caught morning light, 15 children who'd been reduced to designations, now restored to personhood. Subject K-15 was gone. Kelvin Vale was remembered. And in that remembering, in the sanctuary built from ashes and named for a boy who'd believe someone loved him enough to search forever, something like hope took root and began to grow. The ruins stood. The children laughed. The work continued. And somewhere between memory and peace, Kelvin's voice whispered one final truth. We were real. We mattered. And, because of you, Lily, the world will never forget.